This episode of Author Stories is brought to you by Athon Books. Check out the very best in science fiction and fantasy at athonbooks.com.
You're listening to the Author Stories podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret Wise,
Cher Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am super excited to have Julia Fine on the show with me. Today, we are talking about her brand new book, The Upstairs House. This is such a phenomenal book. If you love thrillers like I do, and books with a psychological twist, and you're absolutely going to love this book. This must be on your bedside table or by your reading chair or wherever you love to fall into a book, because I promise when you fall into this one, you won't crawl out until the very end. Welcome to the show, Julia.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so sorry. I just knocked my boom microphone with my headphones. Sorry about that. Julia, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
My first memory of wanting to be a writer. I have always been a reader since I was very, very young, and sort of basically lived at my local library. But I think I decided that I wanted to be a writer. Probably we had this old desktop computer that was like the family computer that had a word processing system on it. And I would just like sit there and monopolize it writing stories. But the stories it was always like the first 3 pages of a novel. And that was as far as I would get. I was maybe like 8 or 9. And so I probably have somewhere in the ether are dozens of beginnings of my elementary school aged novel. And so that probably is the memory, but it wasn't until after college and when I was sort of unhappy in, I guess, the career, if you could call it that I had chosen. I was working in public relations and I hated it. And that was when I sort of said, let me go back to sort of what I really wanted to do. So there's my childhood memories where it was sort of a hobby. And then probably in around like 2011, 2012, when I sat down and said, this is really something like that I want to do.
So you would consider yourself to be a bookish kid? You said that you were always...
Yeah. Yes, my friends were books. I had some friends, I think, but I definitely, I was one of those kids who would go to the library once a week, check out 5 books, and just like read one in a sitting.
So let me ask you, was there ever a book or a series or an author that just completely changed the way you think about books, that opened your mind to the possibility that books could transport you to a new place and new emotions and all of that stuff?
I remember reading Philip Pullman's Dark Materials series as they were coming out. And I think that's a book series where the first book, it's fantasy and it's a different world, but it feels like a more traditional fantasy. Obviously, there's elements of it that are super unique. But then when he came out with the second book, I remember realizing, I was still fairly young, and they are books for kids, which I guess it's a whole nother conversation of whether those actually are books for children, but they're marketed toward children and kids can read them. And I remember seeing sort of how the worldview shifted, because it's you go from sort of believing that the world he's created is this one world to this sort of multiverse astrophysics situation. Right. And I remember thinking like, oh, you can talk about philosophy in books and you can talk about ideas, and it's not just about telling a good story with compelling characters. It's also like books are about ideas, which I think was something I had I had understood intrinsically, I'm sure. But I remember with those books really thinking, oh, this is a deliberate conversation. It's not just me sort of reading into something, like this is what he's trying to do here. And of course, after that, I became an English major. So
Well, looking at the two books that you've published, now seeing those early influences of Philip Pullman really brings into focus kind of where I think that you might be coming from as a storyteller. What is it about fantasy that you love so much? Is it the ability to tell kind of plain truths, but to kind of mask them in fantastical settings? What is it about the power of fantasy that allows us to do that?
I mean, I love to read sort of more traditional, like high fantasy stuff. But I don't know that I could ever write it. I feel like that there's sort of traditional fantasy, which I say, I think like Tolkien or like Mercedes Lackey is one that I read a lot as a kid, but sort of those world, like the world building sort of high fantasy where it's really about all the detail and about really transporting you. And I find myself drawn as a writer really to more what I would call like fabulism or speculative fiction, I think, because I'm not sure that my talent lies in like sort of crafting this entire world from scratch. I have not tried to do it, mostly because I don't know that I would be that successful, but I do love the idea of using sort of fantastical elements and the idea of the speculative, the ability to take sort of these metaphors and make them literal on the page. So in The Upstairs House, it's a woman who is, I was thinking about parenthood and how when you become a parent for the first time, you sort of are mourning the loss of the life that you used to lead and the person that you were and who you might have been without a child. And so I thought, oh, well, here's a ghost story. Let's bring a literal ghost in, and not just talk about the feeling of being haunted, but let's talk about like, now I can tell a haunted house sort of poltergeist story about this feeling. And so I love how you can heighten, again, if I'm writing a novel about ideas, for me, sort of adding a speculative element or some fabulism into it just lets me push it even further and lets me play in a way that I think I would hope it makes it not only sort of about ideas, but also entertaining. I think the entertainment value can come in perhaps with the speculative element as well.
Sure. Your first book that you published, What Should Be Wild, is more of a what I would call a direct fantasy, or and then the new book, The Upstairs House, is more of a psychological fantasy, if you will. Like you're constantly, as a reader, you're constantly wondering, is this real? Is this a figment of her imagination? Is this her working through, some things that she's going through? And I'm talking around the subject because I want to talk specifically about the book in a minute, but I don't want to give away too much yet. But the first book that you wrote, What Should Be Wild, or the first book that you published, was that the first book that you had written?
I wrote a novel length manuscript that was, I feel, like the bad pancake story where like the first one you make is always burnt or mushy or whatever it is. So I have what I would like to call my bad pancake novel, which is never going to see the light of day, and was sort of me working through what it meant to write a novel. But What Should Be Wild was the first book that I sort of was like, hey, someone can read this and I wouldn't feel totally ashamed. So
a lot of people have what they would describe as a desk drawer novel or a trunk novel. You write and then you file it away. I've never heard it described as a bad pancake novel. I love that analogy.
Yeah, it just is. I like it because I sort of, when you make it, I don't make pancakes that often, but when I do, I now know, like, just throw away the first batch. It's not even put it in a drawer. Just throw it away.
So after you wrote that first novel, and we won't dwell on that, but after you wrote that and you kind of got whatever it was that you needed to get out of your system, and you were primed and ready, What was the first idea that came to you for What Should Be Wild? I'm fascinated by the beginnings of things, and where one moment there's a story, and a moment earlier there was no story. It just comes out of the ether. Just it's magic. But for you, what is that first moment? Is it a character that walks on the stage of your mind? Is it maybe a newspaper or magazine article that you read that then starts the what if game in your mind? What was that first kernel of an idea for What Should Be Wild?
For What Should Be Wild, it was a radio, sort of a brief NPR sort of snippet. So What Should Be Wild is about a girl who is born from the womb of her dead mother and has the power to kill and revive with a touch. So like you said, it's much more traditional fantasy. It's I look at it as sort of an adult fairy tale. But there was a legal case in Texas back at this point, it must have been 2012, 2013, where a pregnant woman was brain dead, and there was really no chance of reviving her. And she was, I think, 20 weeks pregnant, and the fetus was not developing. And there was a case of what the family wanted to take her off of life support, and the state said, no, because she's pregnant, you can't. And so there was a whole legal battle. And I heard about that, and I immediately thought, I was fascinated by one, like, say, there was some medical miracle where the baby was able to continue to gestate, even though, it just wasn't biologically possible, but say it was. So there's the fantasy that comes in. What would it be like to sort of be born from that legacy? And then I also was very interested in just looking at the way the women's bodies were controlled, and the way sort of it was no longer sort of how society felt so comfortable saying, this is the situation, we have the right to make these decisions. And so What Should Be Wild sort of came out of those two things, and it ended up being really a book about women's bodies and women's role in society.
Authors, I have a fantastic new service to tell you about. It's called PubSite. PubSite is a service to help you build your very own website, your home on the web, where you can promote your work and give your fans a place to connect with you. PubSite is a website platform that allows every author, regardless of budget, to have a great-looking professional website, developed by the book marketing professionals at FSB Associates. PubSite is the new, easy-to-use DIY website builder developed specifically for books and authors. Whether you're an author of one book or 20, or a small publisher, PubSite allows you to build, design, and most importantly, update your website pain-free. No need to be dependent on a designer or webmaster to make a small but costly change to your website. Save the money and do it yourself. PubSite is the best platform for authors because it's a book-centric platform. PubSite was built just for authors and small publishers. Every design, feature, and layout is book-centric. They have customized designs for you to use. It's easy to build. No coding or HTML is necessary to create a stunning, professional-looking website with all the features you want. Get a custom domain name, yourname.com. It's simple to update. You can add all of your books, add a blog and a book tour, sell from any retailer, manage your email list and social media, and even do e-commerce. Build your website with a 14-day free trial, then pay just $19.99 per month, which includes hosting. And we offer packages starting at $499 to set up the website for you. Pub-site.com, the place to help authors find their home on the web.
Dream Author by Sophie Hannah is an immersive 14-month coaching program for writers at any and every level of experience, and also for those of you who want to write and are just waiting for the right encouragement and guidance to get you started. Your writing dreams should make you happy. For so many of us, our dreams are not a source of happiness. Instead, they cause us stress, guilt, frustration, and even shame. Here's the great news. All of these feelings are natural and all writers experience them. The problem, though, is that when your writing dreams bring you more anxiety than joy, it affects your resolve and your productivity, and you end up not taking the action you need to take in order to propel your dreams in the right direction so that they can stand a strong chance of coming true. That's why Sophie created the Dream Author Coaching Program,
to teach anyone who is passionate about writing how to change the way they build, think about, and pursue their writing dreams in order to become their own most powerful ally and advocate for the rest of their writing life. And more great news. Once you've learned that skill, it lasts forever. Visit dreamauthorcoaching.com to get started today.
So when you start, thinking of heady topics like that, if you were to publish a book purely about that topic as an exploration of that topic, there may or may not be a wide audience that would like to sit down and read and ponder about those. But when you couch it in a story and you couch it in a fairy tale and a fantasy, you really open up the ability to talk about much broader subjects to a much broader audience. That's one of the things that I love about fantasy in particular and fiction in general, is that it really does lower barriers to let people kind of shelve their preconceived notions and walk out a story through someone else's experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that in both of my books, but particularly the new one, I'm talking a lot about new motherhood and some of the more difficult aspects of it. And I think that there's a part of people, I'm sure that there will be people who will look at The Upstairs House, which is about a postpartum woman who's really struggling, and sort of say, how can you, mothers aren't supposed to be that way. But what I was trying to show is, that by, like you said, instead of just writing about, like, a lot of moms feel this way, you say, here's a character who you get to know and you relate to, and you go through the journey with this particular character. And for me, the goal of fiction and literature in general as a reader is to try to sort of walk side by side through experiences that I myself could never have, and try to understand the way other people view the world. And so I think when you have both sort of the project of fiction and literature in general, and then you add that speculative element, that's something that sort of makes people feel both entertained and also sort of removed from the immediacy of the emotion. Like you can say, like, oh, this is a ghost story, so it's not as scary for me to read about these feelings, which is funny to say, because, like, a ghost story obviously is scary, but on an emotional level, on a, like, does this hit too close to home if you're able to read it and say, like, oh, this is a woman and it's a ghost story, and so it doesn't feel necessarily so much like something painful for me personally, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So you published What Should Be Wild as your first novel, your debut novel, and we talk a lot on this show about the gift of anonymity. And there's something about when you write that first book, no one is expecting it. A handful of people are. You've got an agent, you've got a publisher, you have family members that know you're doing it, but the wider world does not know that Julia Fine is writing a book and I need to be expecting this book. But when you publish that first book, then people start to pay attention. And then, I wonder when Julia Fine's going to publish her next one. And then Julia Fine is probably under contract for another book. And so, there are obligations that come with that. And that second book always has the baggage of all that stuff that comes with it, for good or for ill. What was, when you published What Should Be Wild, did you have the new book already in mind? The Upstairs House, was that already percolating in your mind, or
No,
what was that process?
So I sold each book separately, and it is with the same publisher and the same editor, but I didn't try to go out with, some people will go out with an idea or maybe the first 75 pages. And I waited, my agent and I waited until we had the full book to sell it, which I think took off a lot of pressure, because there was no, I felt like if this book didn't work, there was nobody expecting me to sort of force it into a shape that it couldn't be in, which was nice. We'll see if that's sort of how I want to do things forever. But for a second book, I think it was nice because it did take off some of that pressure, because if this didn't work, it would be frustrating because I had devoted so much time to it, but there wasn't money on the line. There wasn't a contract until sort of I knew what it was and it was a full draft. But I started The Upstairs House shortly after, I think I started it actually during my book tour for What Should Be Wild, because I was traveling and I was finally able to sort of have like a new headspace almost. It's funny, I've written both books at different desks, and that's just because we moved in between them. But I sort of feel like being in a new physical spot is really useful for me in terms of trying to come up with new ideas and sort of get back into the groove of writing a novel. And so, yeah, I didn't start writing The Upstairs House until What Should Be Wild was out, and I didn't really start writing it in earnest until most of the publicity for What Should Be Wild was done. So they really were two separate projects. But I feel like I got very lucky in just being very emotionally attached to The Upstairs House and sort of buying into the project really quickly and really falling in love with the research that I was doing. And I also, the other difference between the two books is I had a baby in between. I had a baby about a year before What Should Be Wild was published, but I had already written it because there's as you know, sort of the pipeline of publishing. It just, you sell the book and it's like 18 months until it comes out. So I had a baby and I had taken a little break because I just was, exhausted and sort of in a fog of new motherhood. But when I did get back to writing, I suddenly had I had time constraints. I wrote during my son's naps, and I think that made it harder in that there was less time, but in a way it also made it easier in that it was more focused time. Like I couldn't spend time just like messing around on the internet or, saying like, oh, I'll get to it later tonight. It was like, this is my 2.5 hours a day, and if I don't get to it now, I won't get to it. And I think that gave the book a sense of urgency, and my writing of the book a sense of urgency that really, for a second novel especially, that can sort of be so difficult to get out, it really just forced the book out of me.
Well, the publishing process that you went through with book one and book two, you sort of insulated yourself from that book two stress that comes by writing it completely and then selling it separately.
Yeah.
Do you feel like, and this is just a what if question, no one really knows, but if book two had been the second book of a 2-book contract, and you published What Should Be Wild, the tone is different in of these 2 books.
Yeah.
They're both fantastical elements, but a different sort. Do you feel like that The Upstairs House would have been a different book coming on the tail of the first book, and that a publisher might have wanted to kind of shoehorn it into what book one was?
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably would. I feel like I also got very lucky in that my first book I think is much, well, they're both pretty niche, I guess. They're just sort of 2 different niche audiences. But I think that, yeah, I definitely could have tried and maybe would have been pushed into writing something more like What Should Be Wild. But I think one of the reasons The Upstairs House works so well is because I sort of steered clear. It's a much more adult book. Like, they're both books for adults, but in one I was writing about a teenager. And this is just like much more firmly sort of in the grown-up world. And I'm not sure that I would have been able to make that jump. Not even that I would have had pressure from the publisher, but I think sort of just like you said, like just sort of thinking about them as a bundle, it might have been harder to distinguish The Upstairs House and differentiate it.
So we've talked about The Upstairs House enough. Let's get into it. The Megan Weiler. Tell me about Megan. Where did she come from, and what was it that connected you to her so deeply?
Yeah. So Megan in The Upstairs House, she's the protagonist and she's the main narrator, and she the book opens with her like in the hospital immediately having just had her first baby, and it follows the baby in the first like 2.5, 3 months of the baby's life. And Megan is a sort of lapsed PhD student. She's getting her PhD in history, and she's working on a dissertation about Margaret Wise Brown, the children's author. And that's sort of how the book then jumps into sort of what Megan's relationship with Margaret Wise Brown becomes. But with Megan, it's interesting because she's definitely very distinct from me, but she also became almost a vessel for some of my own feelings about motherhood. So like I said, I started writing this book in earnest, like really drafting the book when my firstborn, was about a year old. And I had a lot of thoughts about sort of what I had just been through as a new parent. And I felt like I had not seen a lot depicted in fiction or even on film about, there's not enough about early parenthood in general, but there was really very little about those first few weeks with a brand new baby and how life-changing that is and how just emotionally and physically difficult it is. And so I really wanted Megan to be sort of serve as a way for me to talk about my own feelings, but also just as, a representation of what I think a lot of women go through after having a baby that they then don't really see in popular culture. Like there's a lot of, oh, you're home with your baby and it's so sweet and cozy and cuddly and how nice that you have maternity leave, things like that. And Megan really struggles because she sort of feels the loss of her identity before she had a baby, and she doesn't have the time or the mental space to keep working on this dissertation, and her husband means well, but he is often gone, and he's a little bit sort of bumbling clueless, and she just has a lot of feelings about her new role as, having to be awake with the baby and having to nurse the baby and not having her own sort of having to put her own needs second, which we sort of take for granted. I think that, mothers put their own needs second. That's like, being a mother means sacrificing. But there's a shift. Well, two things. One, there's a shift into that role, I think, where you have to, if you do believe that being a mother means sacrificing your own needs, you don't just go from being your own person who really is only beholden to yourself to suddenly, giving up everything for a baby, like literally overnight, the baby's in you and then comes out of you, and all of a sudden you're supposed to just give things up. Like there's a transition period. And I guess the second thing being, is that really what it means to be a mother? Should that be what motherhood means, that you sort of sacrifice? Like obviously we say, you do anything for your kids, you love your kids deeply, but is it possible? I guess my question in this book is, and the question that Megan poses and represents is it possible to love your kids but not necessarily want to sort of take on that traditional stereotypical role of motherhood? Can motherhood be something other than that, that total sacrifice and that total sort of erasure of self? And so Megan is there sort of to answer all of my questions about these things. And we sort of watch her as she struggles with those questions and as she sort of falls further and further into basically a postpartum mood disorder that is also sort of a haunting.
So the character of Margaret Wise Brown factors prominently in the story, and I'll let the readers decide if she's a fictional character or if it's the actual embodiment of Margaret Wise Brown. That's one of the fun things to kind of unravel in the story. Why Margaret Wise Brown? What was it about her that connected so deeply with you?
So I had read as a kid, I think I had read Runaway Bunny and Goodnight Moon and was sort of aware. It's hard not to be aware of that just because those books are everywhere. And, Goodnight Moon, I think, is like the best-selling children's book globally of all time. So I knew the name and I knew the main sort of popular books. And then when my son was born and I was reading those books over and over and over and over, I was sort of struck by how I could read Goodnight Moon, especially every night for 5 months straight and still be interested in it. It wasn't boring to me. It was, it felt like in the way that sort of the best poetry, you can just read it over and over and over and over and get something new out of it every time. And so I was curious about Margaret. And when I went in, I guess, sort of expecting her to be in Goodnight Moon, there's like the quiet old lady whispering hush who sits in the rocking chair with a little stocking cap while the baby bunny falls asleep. And I expected Margaret Wise Brown to sort of embody that, whether or not she was sort of an old woman or just to have, that attitude, that ethos. And I was shocked because once I started reading a biography of her, she was just so different than what you would imagine. She died at 42, so she was never, ever an old woman. And she was in this 10-year lesbian relationship with an older woman, and she was a rabbit hunter. She was very sort of glamorous. She gave this famous interview where she said she didn't care for children, which it seems like was tongue-in-cheek, but that got picked up. And, so she was just she's like sassy and interesting, and I just like fell in love with her. And I felt like my reading of her work then got so much deeper with a new understanding of who she was. I just read her books so differently. And I was really then excited to have my goal is for other people then, whether it's through reading The Upstairs House, you decide you know her well enough, or you read The Upstairs House and you want to seek out more information about her. I think, I really do feel like she deserves to be known more sort of for the life she led. And I wanted other people to have that same experience of rediscovering her books through this new lens, especially because she was a great children's writer, but she also came from this tradition. She worked in New York City, and she came up at a school called the Bank Street School of Education, or the Bureau of Educational Experiments. And so a lot of her books are based in research and sort of research into early childhood education and child psychology, and she was using a lot of elements of sort of modernism, so like Gertrude Stein, James Joyce, some of the stuff that they were doing for adults, she was sort of implementing for children. And so there's just so many layers and so much there when you step back. It's so much more than just like Goodnight Room. And so so I hope that was in the beginning the impetus, and then I guess as I got to know her more as a character, I felt like she was just such a good, ghostly friend for Megan to have too, in terms of just like bouncing ideas off of each other about like being, about conformity and about relationships with children. And
So The Upstairs House is a great fun read. I don't want people to think that it is not an enjoyable, entertaining, page-turning read, because it absolutely is. But at the end, you're left thinking about these kind of heady topics of motherhood and how we change when we become parents, both women and men, and what the stages of life that you go through, and how you're kind of different people, and a major thing is how we deal with mental health, and that we just don't want to talk about it. But when someone gets to the end of The Upstairs House and closes that back cover, what do you hope they're left with?
I hope that they come away with an understanding of how nuanced parenthood can be. And I hope that whether there's someone who has a new parent in their lives and sort of now recognizes what that new parent might be going through, or is a parent, or sort of is someone themselves who's had some of these feelings that we've been told are taboo and that we don't really talk about. I hope that they, would recognize themselves and recognize that it's not just, good mother, bad mother, love my baby entirely, or wish I wasn't a mom. There's so many layers to it. It's such a nuanced experience. I hope that readers come away thinking more deeply about the different ways that women can inhabit the role of mother, and men the role of father, and the different ways that we sort of as a society can help parents through those first few months, which are really, really difficult, and are especially difficult right now, when a lot of the networks that we've relied on, even having like someone in your house to hold the baby while you sleep is really hard during a pandemic. And so I hope that people sort of come away thinking like, what can we as a society do to support parents, I guess.
Absolutely. The Upstairs House is available everywhere now, no matter how you like to consume books, whether it's in hardback and, actual paper or Kindle edition or audiobook. It's available everywhere now, and you can grab it. There are links to the book in the show notes of this episode. Julia, this has been so much fun chatting. If people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you do, where can they find you online?
I'm on Twitter at Fine, Juli, FINEJULI, or my website is julia-fine.com.
Excellent. We'll put links to those in the show notes to make it easy for folks to find you. Julia, I love the book. I love everything that you're doing. We're going to send everyone to see you. Thank you for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you so much. This has been really fun.
Authors, if you're looking for a partner to help ensure that your book is the best it can possibly be, look no further than Pico's House. Crystal and her staff make a conscious effort to be critical yet courteous. They also strive to make the business side of things run smoothly so that you can rest easy knowing that your manuscript is in capable hands. Whether you need beta reading, developmental editing, a manuscript critique, line editing, copy editing, or proofreading, Pico's House is the one-stop shop for you. Check them out today at picoshouse.com to get started. The Bad Company Complete Series Omnibus, Books 1 through 7. Humanity's Greatest Export. Justice. Space is a dangerous place, even for the wary, especially for the unprepared. The aliens have no idea. Here comes The Bad Company. The Bad Company Book 1, Colonel Terry Henry Walton takes his warriors into battle for a price in this first installment of The Bad Company. He believes in the moral high ground and is happy to get paid for his role in securing it. Set in the Cutherian Gambit universe, Terry, Char, and their people humans, werewolves, were-tigers, and vampires form the core of the Bad Company's direct action branch, a private conflict solution enterprise. Join them as they fight their way across Tissakinnon 4, where none of the warring parties were what they expected. The 7-book series omnibus includes The Bad Company, Blockade, Price of Freedom, Liberation, Destroyer, Discovery, Overwhelming Force. Grab the complete Bad Company series by Craig Martell now. How to Be a Badass Witch by Michael Anderle. Virtutus Gloria Mercies. Translation: Glory is the reward of valor. Fed up with playing the normal game, recent university graduate, ex-cum laude, ex-soccer star, ex-popular and mostly broke Cara Madano changes her life when she decides to research how to be a witch and believes it. Cara didn't want to go back east and deal with her overbearing mom, so when university was done, she stayed behind in Los Angeles. Little did she realize how controlling moms can be from the other side of the country. Feeling a little desperate to make her own way, she buys a few books on business and one on a lark, How to Be a Badass Witch. That's when the trouble started. Find out just what trouble a young woman can get into when the magic just might be real. How to Be a Badass Witch by Michael Anderle.